Welcome to Derisky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Jeff Gertz. So Emily, we have a special episode today for a couple of reasons. First, this is a live recording, live from the CNAS annual conference at the Mayflower Hotel here in Washington, D.C. Got slightly grander ballroom to record in than our normal little studio.
That's right, and the other reason it's a special episode for us is that it is our 1-year anniversary of Derisky Business. So happy podiversary, Jeff.
Happy podiversary to you too.
Yes. And for those listening at home, we have a very delightful cake brought out by Charles Horn. Charles cannot leave yet, though, because I did want to thank Charles and the rest of our production team. This podcast does not happen without Charles Horn, Anna Peterson, Eleanor Hume, and Kyle Rudder, all of whom are behind the scenes every other week or so whenever we get an episode out. So thank you, Charles, and everyone give him a big round of applause.
Thank you.
All right, it is making me nervous to have a live flame on the stage, so Jeff, can you blow that out for us? All right. Oh, that didn't work out well. All right, we should have rehearsed that a little better. All right. So we launched this podcast, Derisky Business, about a year ago to cover the ever-growing policy space of economic security. It had become clear to us that economics and national security were no longer held in separate silos. They were increasingly coming together, whether that was export controls, investment screening, US-China tech competition, tariffs, perhaps. We'll get to tariffs. And so we thought it made sense to have a place where we could talk about these issues in a much more kind of informal, current way. And that's why you've had to put up with about 30 or so episodes of Derisky Business over the last year.
That's right, Emily. We've covered so many issues, lots of issues coming back several times we've noticed. So TikTok, another recurring topic here. Yep. Spent a lot of time talking about Nippon and US Steel and that ongoing saga. But there's really one topic that we've come back to more than any other, and that, of course, is tariffs.
That's right. So our very first episode over a year ago was titled, Everyone Loves Tariffs. And I'm sure that still holds. I think everyone still loves tariffs.
Yeah, I don't know, is it our fault that we've had the last year of tariffs?
I don't think it's our fault. But in that context, I mean, even though we were talking about tariffs a year ago, it was such a different conversation we were having. At that point, we were talking about kind of a very slow and steady incremental change in the tariff landscape. We were talking about President Biden using tariffs in this very kind of narrow, targeted way to try to shore up some domestic industries, really focused on clean tech, focused on chips, focused on EVs. And that seemed like a big deal at the time, but now that seems like small ball.
Yeah, exactly. What a world it was. You know, so we were focusing both on kind of the Biden tariffs announced in sort of late April 2024, focused on China, and then also at the time the kind of Trump campaign promises where he was saying, oh, maybe we'll have a 10% universal tariff, maybe we'll have 60% tariffs on China. And I think that was the real question then: is this just kind of empty campaign talk, or is this a serious policy proposal? And you know, as you heard it more and more at every rally Trump went to, I think we started to say, all right, time to take this seriously, and we've seen a year later, yes, he is serious about this.
He does appear to be serious about tariffs, that's correct. And why do we spend so much time on this issue, right? There's so much we can and do cover on Derisky Business, but we end up spending so much time on the trade and tariff issues, particularly now, because it's such a big shift in US international economic policy, such a big shift in how the US engages with the global economy. It's worth noting, you know, in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, there were higher tariffs on more countries just in that first few weeks than the entirety of the first Trump administration. It's not an overstatement to say it was the highest shift, the highest increase in tariffs for 60, 70 years. So we talk about tariffs so much because there's been such a massive change in the landscape in terms of how we use this particular tool. We also talk about it a lot because there's still so much uncertainty about how it's all going to unfold. Obviously, folks, I'm sure, are following the negotiations that are ongoing with the United States and almost every other country in the world. I don't know if they're doing herd in McDonald Islands,
sure,
but almost every other country in the world. So there's just so much dynamism in this space and so much uncertainty about how those negotiations are going to unfold, although we have some thoughts on that, which we'll get to. But I think really for us in a think tank, one of the reasons we want to spend so much time thinking about this trade issue is that we do think we're at an important inflection point in the international economic order. Like the global economy, the global economic order, it won't be the same. There's no going back to a world in which it was just sheer globalization, low tariff rates, open markets. That's partly because of Trump, but it's partly because of just shifts in the geopolitics that we've seen for the last 5 to 10 years. So there's no going back.
Yeah, exactly. So if we're not going back, I think the question is, where are we going? So we thought we'd focus our discussion today on some of these big picture questions about how will the trade wars unfold and what does the future of the global economic order look like. So we definitely want to take advantage of this being a live event and having a live audience. A couple ways we want to engage with the audience. One, everybody either in the room or watching at home, please do submit questions at cnas.org/live, and we will kind of incorporate those into our conversation as we go. But second, again, sort of having room full of people in front of us here, we want to do a little bit of live polling to kind of gauge reactions on how you all think the trade wars may be unfolding. So we're going to do some polling by round of applause on a few different yes/no questions to get your sense on kind of how are the trade wars going to unfold. So I think the place to start maybe is just the kind of overarching question: are Trump's tariffs going to stick around? Is this, actually a sort of real change in U.S. trade policy that will be, lasting at least through the next sort of 3-4 years, we can imagine? Are we moved from a world of the U.S. having, 2% tariffs around up to the sort of new normal of 10% tariffs? So let's do a quick kind of, poll of the room here by round of applause. Who thinks a year from now we will have average tariff rates of around 10% or higher?
That may be the first time we got a room full of Washington, D.C. people to cheer.
Yeah, cheering for tariffs. Yeah, everybody, this is on the record, everybody loves tariffs.
Everyone
right?
loves tariffs. Everyone loves tariffs.
All right, let's poll the opposite side. Who thinks the opposite, that a year from now we'll be back to sort of the general low tariff rate, kind of 2-3%, tariffs are sort of passing fancy? Moderate response. But I think that was a clear win for the tariffs are going to stick around. And I think, certainly for me, that's my view as well. I do think, again, going back to the campaign, this is something Trump has been talking about for a long time. I think what we've seen over the first sort of 4 or 5 months of his administration now, the second administration, is that he just is very serious about this. And as we've watched all the different negotiations play out, that sort of 10% universal tariff idea is sticking around even for the countries that get to successful deals.
I think that's totally right. And exactly what that tariff structure will look like, I think that is certainly up for grabs. But there's no question in my mind that we're headed towards a higher tariff environment. I might remind our friends on Wall Street to kind of keep that in mind, because they focus so much on the back and forth, the quick reversals, and that's all interesting and important to watch. But the longer term trend is absolutely towards higher tariffs across a range of countries and a range of products. It is the one very firmly held belief that Trump has, which is that tariffs can work and we need to use them aggressively.
Yeah.
All right, so our next question is about China. Obviously a major front in the ongoing trade wars. So we're again going to ask for the audience to weigh in here. So round of applause if you think that there will be a grand bargain between the United States and China on the trade issues. Oh, no one. Wait,
Deafening silence.
Hold on, I'll wait. No, okay. So round of applause if you think there is no grand deal in the offing. Ooh. Well, that's optimistic.
That was a decisive answer.
That was a decisive. Well, what do you, I tend to agree with the audience here. I think it's hard to see what the contours of a deal would look like. I'll say we looked at this question when we did some wargaming around the trade question, and what came out there is that there might be some sort of superficial deal, maybe some transactional deal, but that neither side really had the faith that the other side would come to the table to make meaningful, durable concessions. And I think you're seeing that play out even in the last couple of weeks. What we've seen, you had extreme tariffs and the tariffs come down, then export controls go up, and now the deal's off, and it's just very uncertain where this could land in a positive space. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I guess a lot of this probably depends a little bit on how you define grand bargain, because I do think there's a sort of, coordinated rollback of tariffs like we saw in Geneva a few weeks ago. Sort of that type of deal seems in the offing. I continue to think that eventually Trump does really want a TikTok deal, and so I think there will be some type of negotiation that involves, some rollback of tariffs, kind of some TikTok deal. Maybe there's some kind of critical earths, rare minerals piece to that as well. But in terms of a kind of actual grand bargain that would address the fundamental obstacles in the U.S.-China relationship, that is really about the sort of, structure of the Chinese economy and how to integrate that into a market-based global trading system, that is not in the offing, and there's no signs from the Chinese that they are thinking about those types of big reforms that would be necessary to get that done.
Yeah, I mean, what's China going to put on the table, right? I mean, hopefully there will be a conversation about fentanyl. That was the initial reason for the first 20% tariffs in the Trump administration. But are they going to shift the structure of their economy to move away from massive exports that's leading to the trade deficit that's a core concern of the president? Seems unlikely.
They're not privatizing SOEs. Like, that is not going to happen here. All right, one more audience question for now. So, it's clear that the Trump administration has a sort of theory of the case on tariffs, which is that tariffs will lead to greater U.S. investment, that in the face of tariffs, both U.S. and foreign companies will want to increase their domestic presence in the U.S. market to get around the tariff wall. So again, by round of applause, who thinks tariffs will lead to more U.S. investment? All right, a smattering of applause, we can say. Who takes the opposite view, that the tariffs will not lead to more U.S. investment?
All right, some skeptics.
Yeah, I think, division, but I think more people are very skeptical of the Trump theory here. I mean, I'll say for my part, I don't want to endorse the Trump theory because I don't think it's kind of fully going to play out that this is all kind of, a garden of roses and everything will be great. I do think, though, that kind of faced with being shut out of the U.S. market, you do see a lot of companies that will want a U.S. presence and will kind of, invest domestically. We actually ran a sort of little mini kind of TTX scenario this morning, thinking through kind of what our private sector response is to tariffs. And you see that reluctantly, many people will engage in the U.S. economy. Now, I think the question is sort of at what cost, right? It's sort of you get marginal more investment, but with higher inflation, with slowing economic growth. It doesn't necessarily mean it was all worth it, but I do think there is a path to more U.S. investment here.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be access to the U.S. market that's key. So the other thing that we saw this morning was that if there is, for example, successful renegotiation of the North America Trade Pact, actually Mexico could do quite well in that scenario, because if they retain that access to the U.S. market, which is enormous, let's not forget about that. It is a very important market for most companies. That there could be some winners outside the U.S. context as well, but clearly for the companies that are in the U.S. and they're kind of faced with this decision of how do they navigate the tariffs, how do they kind of navigate the kind of personal relationship with President Trump, I think we're already seeing that a lot of companies are making the decision that they're gonna try to do what they can to increase that investment in the U.S. As they try to think about this broader, very complex tariff environment.
And you can be sure they're going to put out a big splashy press release about whatever it is.
Sure, they will. All right, so we're going to give the audience a break and kind of just chat a little bit about some of the other topics that we get questions on all the time and that are coming up in our conversations with industry, with foreign government counterparts, U.S. government counterparts. Folks who are in the audience, either in person or online, can go to cnas.org/live if they want to submit questions. Otherwise, Jeff and I are just going to ask each other the questions. So I mentioned USMCA and the North America trade deal, but I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on this intense set of negotiations that the U.S. is moving forward with right now with almost every country in the world. And what do you think are the most likely candidates for actually getting to a positive outcome there? We've seen the UK with an outcome, right? We've seen China with an outcome, although whether we call that a trade deal as opposed to just an oopsie-poopsie, is debatable. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so, we've certainly been closely following the reporting saying there's a group of 18 countries or so that are coming in for sort of weekly meetings with the administration to get to framework agreements during this 90-day pause of the reciprocal tariffs. My own view, it seems likely that maybe sort of the Japanese and the Koreans, I think, do really want to get to something. It seems like there's a deal space there that's possible. I do think some of the other Southeast Asian countries, kind of Vietnam, seems to be kind of engaging quite seriously in this effort, I know. So I would expect to see some outcome there. Again, how far any of these agreements go is up for debate. I think, frankly, the UK agreement had some elements of cooperation in it, but still ended with a 10% tariff, and frankly, not big concessions on the UK side. So if that's the model we're looking at, I think we should temper our expectations. But I would expect to see another handful of agreements like that. I will add, I think there are also places that are going to find it much more difficult. And top of that list, frankly, is the European Union and our friends in Brussels, who are in a bit of a tough position here. I think they are unlikely to accept an agreement that looks like the UK agreement, where they are still facing the 10% tariffs. I think given that, they are quite likely to retaliate with their own tariffs, and I think that does kind of put them in that potential retaliatory spiral that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a bunch of things that could trip up negotiations. I think it's clear every country is going to want to have the conversation with the U.S. administration. They kind of don't have a choice, right? If they want to keep that access to the U.S. market, they have to come in and figure out what that deal space looks like. But the stumbling blocks are, well, is everyone just going to get stuck with a 10% tariff? And whether it's for revenue generation or trade deficit, whatever it is, that's still a 10% tariff, right? So the rationale almost doesn't matter if you're stuck with, a very high tariff rate compared to what the U.S. traditionally had. There's also this question of how hard is the U.S. pushing on economic security issues in the trade talks, right? So we've certainly heard that it's been coming up in terms of, well, can we use the trade talks as leverage to line up policies on export controls or on investment screening? And with some partners, I think that makes a ton of sense. If you look at the relationship with even Canada, with the UK, with Australia, there's already cooperation there. You can build on that. There's aligned security interests, and it would make a lot of sense. I think it's a lot harder when you look at a country like a Malaysia, a Singapore, a Vietnam, and particularly when the U.S. is putting new types of commitments on the table, right? So we're hearing as well about really strict rules of origin in countries like Vietnam. Basically, you can't have any Chinese content in your good if you want it to come into the United States. That's a really, really hard choice to put these countries in, because now that we're forcing them to choose between the United States and China. And for some of those partners, the answer is not clearly that they're going to choose the United States.
Yeah, absolutely, particularly in the context of, we even saw with the UK agreement that had, I think, relatively modest kind of vague gestures at the sort of anti-China coalition building. Kind of China came out with a quite strong statement saying, we don't like this, we're not happy about it. Right. Kind of clear message to every other partner, think twice before you would sign on something like this. So it's going to be an issue. But maybe that's a good pivot on sort of, where's economic security fit into these agreements to talk a bit more about USMCA in depth. It's an area we've both been following. So this is the North American Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, which obviously the Trump administration in his first term renegotiated what was then NAFTA into USMCA. Famously, that included a review clause that says after 6 years, it would be up for kind of review/renegotiation again. It seems the administration is leaning into the idea of a pretty substantial renegotiation, although I think kind of quite how substantial is still up for debate. But Emily, what do you think is going to happen in those USMCA talks when they kind of really kick off in earnest? And what are the changes that might be made to that agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that process is going to heat up once we get towards the end of the summer, and as some of these other deals get signed, or at least they're put on a glide path where you can kind of see it moving to more of a technical level, if, in an optimistic scenario, candidly. But look, what are Canada and Mexico going to be asking for? They're going to be asking for certainty. They got hit really hard in the beginning of the Trump administration with high levels of tariffs that were directly in violation of the USMCA commitments. So they're entering into a complex negotiation that is almost existential for their economies, with no level of certainty about whether, if they make concessions, if they make those sort of hard commitments that the US administration is asking for, does that give them that safety and guarantee from future tariffs moving forward? Now, there's some indications that we may have reached something of a kind of tariff peak when it comes to the North American market. Canada and Mexico were not hit with the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, right? So perhaps that is a sign that things are moving in a more positive direction for the North American partners. But it's going to be a tough negotiation. I think they're going to have to deal with some really hard issues, like the level of Chinese engagement in key sectors in the Mexican manufacturing sector. We've heard a lot about that. And when it comes to autos is going to be a huge issue when it comes to an integrated North American market. And here again, the economic security issues are going to come up. So I think they're going to, I think that is going to move towards a real free trade agreement. Sorry, I don't want to say free trade agreement. We don't say
that. Do we like free trade anymore?
We know, it's a trade agreement. I'll just take off all qualifiers for the North American market. But I think it's going to look really different than what we used to see in these sorts of agreements.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, the idea of trade agreements mostly being about how do we coordinate our lowering of tariffs just sort of is not where the energy is at the moment. I think that's
no, that doesn't seem to be where the energy is. So we also want to talk about the economic impacts of all of this. I mean, obviously in the most recent presidential elections, inflation was a really big concern that was on voters' minds. If you listen to kind of mainstream economists, they will tell you that tariffs are going to lead to inflation. including some really high levels of inflation. If you look at the recent reporting coming out, including of the OECD meetings that are happening this week, the IMF, they're all predicting that a escalating trade war is going to lead to slowing growth, maybe even contraction in some places, which is a pretty scary scenario to think about. But how are you thinking about kind of the economic impacts of the trade war?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start by saying, I'm not a political strategist by any means, but it is definitely a curious choice that, having been through this election where one of these central kind of ideas that were up for debate was this idea of kind of Biden being responsible for high inflation and that kind of costing the Democrats the election, to sort of come in with a policy approach saying, we're going to carry out these sweeping tariffs that everybody is saying is going to lead to price increases. And again, I think it's worth underlining, sort of, even if you think the tariffs are going to kind of work, quote unquote, for almost any definition of what you mean by work, it is associated with higher prices. Like, that is the sort of mechanism through which tariffs have an impact. So we should expect there will be some higher prices no matter what, I think. How is this going to play out? I mean, it's been super interesting watching the Trump administration almost trying to kind of get ahead of the political messaging here and say, look, we are willing to bear the cost, that there may be some short-term pain. They are thinking about this as a kind of very high-level kind of restructuring of the U.S. role in the global economy. They, I think, again, whether you agree with the ends or not, they kind of correctly perceive that there will be transition costs to what they are trying to carry out, and they are kind of trying to lay the seeds to say, maybe we'll only have $2 instead of $30, right? These sort of famous comments from the kind of high-level Trump folks that, we will see how those will play in sort of next political election cycle. But I do think they're kind of prepared for there to be economic costs and are sort of willing to, at least for the medium term, bear those out.
I think that's right, although one thing that we've been watching and we've talked about on the podcast is this idea of, what are the guardrails on the president's tariff actions? Will there be guardrails on the tariff actions of the president? The political issues will, I think, become more salient the closer we get to midterm elections, candidly. And in the wake of the Liberation Day tariffs, you did see at least some glimmers of Republican opposition, very muted as it was. You saw the bond market reaction, which certainly was influential in some of the president's decisions. So I do think there are going to be these external forces that matter to some extent when it comes to how the team is thinking about moving forward with their tariff program in the future, including how they do it, right? There's, I think, an argument to be made that just the very immediate disruptive nature of some of the actions was part of what was leading to the concern. And if there was a more methodical approach, people would still be concerned about higher tariff rates, but if there was time to adjust, if there was time to kind of process the potential impacts and actually adjust over a period of years, maybe some of this, general freakout would be a little bit less.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
So we've got a number of questions coming in through the chat here, so please do keep sending those in at cnas.org/live. Emily, maybe one question to start with, something we've been thinking about. What do you think the recent legal rulings, including by the U.S. Court of International Trade, mean for the Trump administration's tariff policy?
Well, I have bad news. I don't think tariffs are going away. Look, I mean, it was a really important ruling. So the Court of International Trade last week had a pretty sweeping ruling that said that all of the tariff programs that were based on emergency powers, so these are the reciprocal tariffs, it was the 10% universal baseline tariff, that those are just flatly illegal. And there's been a debate about this in the trade community because these emergency powers, they literally don't say the word tariff. There's a question about whether there's sufficient flexibility in the law to authorize the president to use these particular legal authorities to impose tariffs. Now, we'll see how this plays out in the courts. I do think that will be an interesting question to watch. I am not 100% convinced that the courts will strike it down all the way up to the Supreme Court. And even if the emergency powers are off the table, it's worth remembering that the president has a lot of other trade authorities. You've got national security trade investigations, you've got the so-called Section 301 investigations. There's a bunch of other tools that they can pull out of the toolkit to impose tariffs. Now, they haven't used those tools to date because those tools take a longer time. You have to do an investigation, you have to write a report, you have to take public comment. And it seemed like there was a bias to action, as we've heard from the president's team, to kind of move forward fast, and emergency powers, of course, let you do that quickly. So one outcome of all the court actions could be not that there's fewer tariffs, but it's a slower pace of tariffs coming online.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That's sort of wherever this court case lands, and again, there's sort of a lot of uncertainty around that. But it seems pretty clear that the broad thrust of new tariffs, there are kind of many different legal levers that the Trump administration can pull, and I think, they have a number of smart lawyers over there who are kind of going through arcane trade law and Section 338 tariff authorities and all kinds of other things that haven't been used in 100 years if ever. And I think they will find the authorities they need. So again, it may sort of shape them at the edges of exactly sort of how they implement the tariff policy. But I do not think the courts are going to be a sort of significant constraint on can they actually carry out a high tariff policy.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, I mean, we've got tariffs from before Trump 2.0 that were based on these other legal authorities that still stand, right? So those are much more durable, much less risky tariff authorities to use. So I think they'll head in that direction.
Yeah.
What about Congress? So we, of course, have been watching congressional reactions to the tariffs. It's been a bit muted. Republicans control both houses. Do you think that that's going to shift at all? Or what would cause that to shift moving forward?
I mean, it's a good question. So, look, I think the baseline view for what is Congress going to do, baseline is always probably nothing. So that's a sort of starting point for how we should think about congressional action here. Having said that, I'm maybe a bit more, I don't know if optimistic is the word, but at least sort of open to the idea that we'll see some action from Congress here. And I do actually think the idea of kind of bringing back trade promotion authority and actually getting Congress to reclaim some of their, constitutionally mandated authorities over trade policy would be a very useful thing and kind of would be beneficial for kind of US good governance. And you could actually get the right kind of constellation stars aligning to say, all right, the courts are kind of reining in some of Trump's unilateral executive authorities. Meanwhile, we see a number of, both Republicans and Democrats who have some concerns with how this administration is carrying out their trade policy. And you could imagine Republicans stepping up a little bit and saying, all right, we want to support the Trump agenda overall, but we think there's a better way to do this, and here's how Congress can engage in them. That could potentially get you to a trade promotion authority that would actually kind of put a more sort of sound foundational institutional basis behind this big shift in US trade policy. We'll see if it actually happens or not. Again, if you're betting kind of over under, I'd still probably take the under. That is sort of unlikely to happen, but there is kind of, you can squint and see a path there. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely right. And I think kind of the theme we keep coming back to in this conversation and in other conversations we've had is kind of the process here matters. It's so dorky to say, but like the more you have kind of some of these processes in place, the more likely you are to kind of have unintended consequences discovered before you actually implement the policy, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, always a good thing. Yeah. Hopefully it's coming before, not after. We'll see.
We'll see.
So maybe a few more questions from the audience coming in here. So we've got a question from Matt. How do you think other countries can leverage the Trump administration's transactional economic approach in their favor? Can they use his push for US domestic investment to their own benefit? And what can other countries extract from Trump?
Ooh, that's a spicy question.
Yeah.
I don't know that every country can offer a plane. Look, I mean, I do think it's important to note that I think that the deal space, as other countries are coming to the administration and kind of figuring out like what does the deal space look like, it's going to be bigger than just traditional trade issues. So even if you're kind of cabining that in like, well, what should the economic deal space look like? I think you're definitely going to have to talk about tariffs. You're going to have to talk about non-tariff barriers. You should talk about investment, right? I mean, I think that's potentially an area where there could be some win-win outcomes. Investment in the US and some of the kind of key sectors where we want to rebuild manufacturing capacity, that could be a good thing. I think there will be purchase commitments, although I don't know that those have quite as much salience in this administration as they potentially did in the first administration. For me, I think one of the big question marks, though, in thinking about kind of the broader deal space is how much is the administration linking the economic and trade issues with some of the broader issues in the relationship, right? So like when they're talking to Europe, how much are they saying, well, we want you to get rid of your data regulations and also we want you to increase defense spending, right? And so I do think that there is a move to kind of look at these relationships more holistically. And like we've always done that to a certain extent, right? But the question is how directly are those issues being linked in a negotiation and how much are we trying to use tariffs as leverage to get countries to do other things outside of the trade space? And I think that's an area that's just very fluid right now in terms of, well, how hard is that push going to be? And do countries see it as in their interest? Like maybe it's actually helpful in some respects to be able to be like, oh, actually, like, Germany's increasing its defense spending. Maybe that's a helpful thing to be able to talk about in the context of these trade talks.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think specifically that focus on the linkage between national security policy and trade policy is really interesting. And one of the distinct, maybe kind of defining features of how Trump thinks about a lot of these issues. If you go look at the America First trade policy, it says, the memo that came out on day one of the administration, kind of right up at the very top, it's sort of trade policy is national security policy, and that's the lens through which we are viewing these issues. And again, I think there's in some ways, kind of good reason for that, and it makes a lot of sense that all of these issues do run together. I do think that there's a real question, going back to sort of what are foreign countries able to extract from Trump and how are they thinking about this, kind of where is Trump thinking about trading off national security issues for some of his trade priorities? And I think it's come up kind of most notably in the case of AI chips and kind of, is there a sort of deal on the table of loosening export controls around AI chips or sort of holding those out as leverage to get market access to other things, which is a very different way from how the United States has traditionally thought about national security export controls, and I think could get quite messy quite quickly.
That's absolutely right. I mean, but since you brought up export controls, it's worth thinking through how everything that's happening on the trade space kind of fits into the broader tech competition space, right? I mean, tariffs are one tool. We've talked a lot on the podcast about export controls and how we think about AI diffusion and all of those very complex processes. But what's your sense of how one implements a trade war while also trying to preserve kind of an edge in the tech competition, particularly when it comes to China?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I actually think, from what I see in the administration, I'm not sure that they're putting these things together, but in my head, they're kind of completely run together.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a number of different areas where you think the trade war is going to run into the tech competition agenda. So one is, so much of the tech competition agenda is trying to line up our allies to be on our side, and this, again, in kind of broad terms of sort of US-China competition. We want to get as much of the world sort of on the US side in this war. At the same time, we're sort of picking fights with them all over the place, and all of our sort of traditional allies are understandably a little pissed off with the United States at the moment and are kind of not super keen to follow our guidance on, you need to stop China from getting access to these technologies or whatever else, these sort of other asks we may be making of them, given everything we're doing on the trade front. So I think that's one area that is going to cause some friction in that kind of tech competition area. The other question is thinking about, what a lot of the kind of run faster agenda on tech competition is in terms of how are we ensuring that, US leadership is moving as quickly as possible here. And we want to make sure that we are advancing our own technological capabilities as quickly as possible. This is something that I think the administration is quite focused on. I think, we heard earlier today talk about sort of AI dominance being a big theme that this administration is pushing, and I think there's, a lot of value in that. But I do think there's potentially going to be some real friction between a trade policy, and again, I'm sort of thinking specifically about the idea of, Section 232 national security tariffs on semiconductors, and particularly on kind of, leading edge chips that is at least being kind of debated about and talked about now. To put it blunt, if we are kind of putting tariffs on the most advanced chips and on, frankly, like all of the products and goods that go into building advanced AI data centers, we are needlessly slowing ourselves down in this tech competition fight. So, how are we thinking strategically about where we want to put tariffs in a way that we are not hobbling ourselves in the tech competition, I think is a big issue. And I hope those conversations are happening within the administration, that the people that are focused on the kind of tech competition run faster are able to have at least some influence over the trade policy questions to make sure that we are not kind of getting in the way of each other there.
Yeah, especially because there are some areas of what the Trump administration is thinking about on the domestic kind of tech build out side of things that actually could be pretty helpful, right? When you talk about kind of getting rid of kind of excessive permitting and some of the techs, maybe it is something that would be kind of an accelerator for some of the data center build out. But how do we make sure that all of these policies kind of work together and aren't counterproductive?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, another question from the audience here from David. Is there a way that tariffs could be helpful for the US economy or national security and good for the US consumer?
And good for the U.S. consumer.
Oh, yeah. And or, I guess. Let's take
Yeah, I'm going to go with or. Or is way easier. Well, look, I mean, we may sound critical of tariffs at some times, but I do think there's a really important role for tariffs in certain instances, right? So we have been thinking about this in the context of legacy chips, for example. So we just talked about advanced AI chips, which are really only made by a handful of companies and mostly in Taiwan, right? So if you put a tariff on that, you just are making that product more expensive for yourself. The fact pattern's a little bit different, though, when you're thinking about a product like legacy chips, where China's just building out a massive amount of capacity to make these chips. If they use the playbook on legacy chips that they've used on solar, that they've used on EVs, they're quickly going to kind of dominate their own domestic market and then flood the rest of the world with low-cost legacy chips. That could crowd out those sorts of chips, not even just from the US, but from friendly sources, from our kind of Japanese or Korean counterparts. That's not a great security outcome, right? And so I do think that tariffs particularly if we could get a shared solution between the US and other major markets. So if you have kind of a joint tariff wall, that actually could be part of the solution, but it can't be the only solution, right? Because if you build this beautiful tariff wall, you also need to make sure that we're making chips within that tariff wall. And I think, so it's thinking about how you think about more of the proactive, how do you create shared demand, how do you spur demand for some of these chips, which will be more expensive.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, stepping back a little bit, the way I think of tariffs, they are one tool in the broader policy toolkit. Tariffs per se are not kind of inherently good or bad. They can be useful for certain specific things. Even when they are useful, they still have costs. There's kind of a cost-benefit analysis. But then I think your last point there is exactly right. That's sort of, there's almost no policy problem the United States is trying to face today that can be fixed through tariffs alone. It's sort of, tariffs are one piece as part of a broader comprehensive toolkit, often including domestic investment, including export controls, investment security, kind of whatever else that sort of full economic security toolkit looks like. And so I think the challenge for this administration is being kind of so quick to turn to tariffs. How can they kind of complement that tariff approach with the broader, more strategic maybe view of like where are we actually going over the long term, and then how do we make sure we have all the pieces we need to achieve those goals?
Yeah, and because we're not going to completely ignore the consumer
Yes,
part of that question,
yes.
I mean, I think the key for us is it's usually targeted, right? It's strategic goods. It's where you have kind of that holistic plan to how to build capacity. And so the thing that when you're a consumer and you're just going to the grocery store, you're trying to buy food for your family, clothes for your kids, toys, whatever it is, like those aren't really strategic goods. Why should you pay the higher cost for that? I think it's a fair debate for us to be having in terms of the level and scale and breadth of the tariffs that we're seeing to date.
Yeah, exactly. It goes to the question sort of like what level is the consumer willing to pay for this, and how do we sort of make the case that that is worth paying?
That's right. That's right. All right, so we are coming up towards the end of our live podcast session. We have one more question for the audience. And perhaps whoever cheers the loudest gets the piece of cake. So a little bit of incentive there. And then Jeff and I will react as well. Will the US win the trade wars? And I know there's going to be somebody in the audience that is like, well, what do you mean by win? So just interpret that as you will. So if you think the US will win the trade wars, let's hear a round of applause. Okay, either people are tired or they're not incentivized by cake. All right, if you think the US will not win the trade wars, round of applause.
Pretty clear answer there, I think. Pretty clear.
All right, do you agree?
Can I be the annoying person that says depends what you mean by win?
Yes. You're that guy. Yeah, go ahead.
No, look, I mean...
But you don't get the cake.
That doesn't count,
Yeah.
No, I think obviously, this is a question we've been thinking a lot about, writing a lot about. I think the answer is there conceivably is a path forward here, right? That kind of, and what we come back to a lot that we've sort of written on before is that there was a need in the current international trade system for a reset, for some fundamental change. Frankly, it's been clear for a while that there was a need for a change. We've seen, the rise of China as now the dominant global trading power in the world that is sort of enmeshed in the WTO system, and yet not really kind of living up to the spirit of what the WTO is meant to be in terms of sort of open capitalist economies. And that fundamental tension kind of was causing real problems that need to be fixed somehow. I think Trump's tariffs kind of are a jolt to that system, and so the question is, where does it go from there?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And as we've been thinking about it, there's kind of three different pathways that this could take. I mean, one is that we kind of muddle along and we get some kind of superficial deals, but overall we just kind of end up with a kind of a muddy, kind of higher tariff scenario that really doesn't fix the underlying problems in the trading system. There's a very kind of extreme possibility on the other end of things, which is that we're just moving towards disorder, right? Rules are all about order, they're about constraints. And clearly in this administration, that's been deprioritized, right? And so when you look at the tariffs, they're all being imposed not at all consistent with the spirit of a rules-based order. So there's certainly a possibility we keep going down that path, we just head towards chaos and disorder, and that's a little bit scary. But I do think, and this is where we're trying to push the conversation a bit in our work, is there's a way to leverage the disruption, right? There's a way to kind of get out of some of the very stagnant conversations that have been happening in the trade space for a while, like when was the last time the WTO did something helpful, like it's been quite some time. There needs to be a change, there needs to be a hard reset. And so it's one of the main pieces of advice we give to foreign governments as they're thinking about how to engage with the US administration right now, is to keep that kind of longer term generational reset of the global economic order in mind. We're not going back to this completely open system, just purely globalized trading system. It's going to have to look different. It's going to have to account for China. It's going to have to account for Russia. And ideally, it should account for the fact that we should have stronger, better, deeper economic relationships with our close security allies. And so that's kind of the North Star as we think about it. And we hope that there will be an opportunity to use the disruption of the current moment to kind of get to that somewhat more optimistic path somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I just add on that. I think that path is out there. We should also be clear, sort of, there aren't a lot of signals from the Trump administration that that's necessarily where they want to go, right? I think achieving that path would look very different from what we've seen so far. You would need a kind of clear strategy from the administration of what exactly they're trying to do, kind of lay out, here's the vision we want to get to. You would stop picking on your allies and partners so much. You would stop, announcing new tariffs by tweet at sort of midnight and then rolling them back the next day. Like, there are a lot of things this administration is doing that is not putting them on that path, but we do still think that path could potentially be out there if you see a big change in how this administration is waging the trade war.
That's right. And we've been up here for 40 minutes. I haven't checked my phone, so it's possible we have a new
There's
trade
new
policy.
tariffs maybe, yeah.
So we'll have to go check. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this live recording of Derisky Business.